It's a great pleasure to welcome to the stage Deepa Mehta. And now, as you can hear, she probably needs no introduction. Thanks. To you, because we have all enjoyed her films. She's a major figure in the Canadian film world. She's best described in one sentence as a transnational, Oscar-nominated screenwriter and director whose work is known for its honesty, beauty, and universality. Her films include Fire, Earth, Water, and Heaven on Earth. And just as we were walking into the building, there was a, yes, that deserves an applause. And as we were walking in, there was a whiteboard, and Jeet noticed that it was something to do with a science class, and it had fire, water, earth, air, and space on it, so we thought that was a good omen. Her latest film is, of course, an adaptation of Salman Rushdie's novel Midnight's Children. Numerous awards include the Lifetime Artistic Achievement for the Governor-General's Performing Arts Awards, Global Leadership Award from the International Film Awards, Outstanding Contribution to International and Local Cinema Award from the Toronto South Asian Film Festival, and we also want to congratulate her on her most recent recognition, the highest civilian award in Canada, the Order of Canada. So please, welcome. And now it's an honor to welcome our next guest, Mr. Jeet Thayil, who I had the pleasure of speaking with on North by Northwest this weekend. And he is an award-winning Indian poet, novelist, and musician. He was born in India, educated in Hong Kong, New York, and Mumbai. His first novel, Narcopolis, which I urge you to read, it's a very dreamy and fascinating, beautifully written look at life in Bombay in the 1970s. It was shortlisted for the 2012 Man Booker Prize. It won the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, and it's currently shortlisted for the Commonwealth Book Prize. He also has written 4 collections of poetry that include These Errors Are Correct, and was awarded the Sahitya Akademi Award for English in 2012. He has edited anthologies, including the Blood Axe Book of Contemporary Indian Poets. He's part of a musical duo, Sridhar and Thayil, whose debut album, STD, was released last year. He's also written a libretto for Babur in London, and you can see his musical side tonight at the closing party at the Lit and Sound Cabaret at Performance Works on Granville Island. But right now, that starts at 9 p.m. Do not miss it. But right now, please welcome Jeet Thayil. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, the artistic director and co-founder of this fabulous festival, Sirish Rao. He's an author who's written 20 books, including children's books, commentaries on street art and popular culture, retelling of Greek plays. He's won several international awards. He's been translated into 17 languages. And he's also a publisher in a previous avatar and is deeply involved with the greatest literary show on earth, the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please welcome Sirish Rao. And I can feel the ideas percolating in the room, so I will leave the stage and allow it all to blossom.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. So welcome, everyone. I mean, I really shouldn't be here. This was supposed to be a conversation between Deepa and Jeet, but they very sweetly and forcefully arm-twisted me, saying that, oh, no, sit along, and who can refuse the two of these? They're very, very persuasive. So, no, it's really great that we're here talking about this. In a way, if I do my job right, I'll recede into the background, and you won't hear much from me after this, and they'll get into a conversation. But really, this whole idea of hybridity rather than multiculturalism. Because somewhere multiculturalism assumes that these things don't cross-pollinate and makes it just many cultures. But we're interested in hybridity and what Pico Iyer described as the global soul. How do we, some of us who have these multiple heritages, influences, inspirations, work this through in life and work? And I must thank also, Deepa's presence here is due to the suggestion of another hybrid soul, Vikram Vij. So Vikram, of course, is very used to this sort of hybridity. And we were just talking about Jeet being here, and he said, Deepa ji, you have to invite Deepa ji. And she was so generous So thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
For being here. So, I mean, to kick it off, the best thing is to be like Freud. Tell us about your childhood.
We only have an hour.
I know. Jeet, why don't you start before we know it'll be over?
No, Jeet, really, because I know deep dark. I mean, if you want to go deep dark, that's fine. But really, what stuck in my mind in one of the conversations we had, and you've spoken about this before, is that moment when you were 13, 14, when your uncle, who has this bizarre museum to Baudelaire, introduced you to Baudelaire. I mean, that's like this, reminds me of that Neruda poem, I don't know when poetry first arrived in search of me. I don't know where it came from. So let's hear about the Baudelaire Museum.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't called the Baudelaire Museum. It should have been. It was just a house in Cochin, of all places. And I think to say he was obsessed is to understate it. He was more than obsessed. I think he was transported by the idea of Baudelaire because, Baudelaire was the original kind of epitome of the romantic, tortured poet with some tremendous psychic wound that manifested itself in wonderful poems. And something about his life, his very short and tragic life, resonated with my uncle. And his entire house was a kind of a shrine to Baudelaire. He had every book by Baudelaire, of course, but also every translation of Baudelaire and every critical work on Baudelaire. And he had portraits of Baudelaire at different stages of his life.
This is amazing. Wow.
And he was translating Baudelaire into Malayalam, of all things. I mean, if you can think of a more, futile kind of, just sweet and futile. And of course, you can't translate Fleur du Mal. It's never been translated by a single translator because you need a small army to translate it. It's such a big book. And of course he never completed it. He wrote one book in his life. It's called Public Law, Some Aspects. He was a lawyer. And he died fairly young, died at, I think, about 51 in London. He was there for a conference, died of a heart attack. But at 14, for some reason, he said I was his favorite nephew. I'm sure he said this to other nephews, but he said I was his favorite nephew and introduced me to Baudelaire. The thing about Baudelaire is if somebody is your favorite nephew, you shouldn't introduce him to Baudelaire. It's just not a good idea because it can ruin a young person's life. As it did mine, I became a poet.
Oh, that's bizarre.
So, and those lines.
Yeah,
Yes.
those lines.
Yeah, well, he gave me a book translated, The Fleur du Mal, translated by George Dillon and Edna St. Vincent Millay, published in around the late 1950s. And the first poem in the book was called Le Lete, which is the mythical river where you drink to forget, the river of forgetfulness. And I read the first lines, and I remember my hair stood on end, and it reminded me of something Emily Dickinson had said, which is that great poetry has a physical effect on you. And it certainly did. And I remember looking for this book when we used to go to Kerala for holidays every 2 years. And I remember looking for this book for 2 years. I never found it. And then when I returned to Kerala after 2 years, found the same book, read the same poem, and exactly the same thing happened. And the first lines were, come to my arms, cruel and sullen thing. Indolent beast, come to my arms again, for I would plunge my fingers in your mane and be a long time unremembering.
Ooh, wow.
Beautiful. So, Deepa, your turn.
Oh
Childhood.
my God, that's a very hard act to follow.
No, but I mean, you too, in a way, I was trying to see when did film and when did poetry enter each of your lives, and for you, I kind of feel there was a cinema paradiso-like moment? Because your father was a distributor of films, and you grew up watching films. So tell us a little about that.
Well, I grew up in a place called Amritsar in India, and Vikram and myself are proud to call it our home. It's a small city which hosts which has the Golden Temple in it. But my father was a film distributor and an exhibitor. So what happened after school was the best way to babysit us was to take us to the movie, and that's where we'd end up, with everybody in tow. And I saw my first film in Amritsar, and it was a film called Mamta, which literally means motherhood, and it was very dramatic and great songs and lovely names and performances. And I remember feeling at that point that I don't know what it is about what I'm seeing. It's so far away. It's on a screen. I can't smell it. I can't touch it. Why am I so moved? And it was my father actually took me to the projection room. I held a piece of celluloid. He walked me to the screen. I got to touch it. And somewhere between the projection room and the screen, magic happened, and I was sold. But more than anything, I think that we talked about hybridity, and was that on Sundays we used to have. Sundays was the only day at 11 o'clock where we'd have what we called morning shows.
Sunday matinee.
Which is the only time we saw what we called white films. And my first white film was Blue Hawaii. And I'll never forget that, It was Elvis Presley, and I said, oh my God, there's the guitar, and there's, there's the moon, and there's Elvis Presley, and I thought that was magic. So it's a question of being exposed at a very early age to another world. So when I came to Canada, it sort of bewildered me that many people hadn't been exposed to my world. And I wondered why that was the case. And of course, when I grew older, it's a whole sort of colonial baggage that one carries. But I'm really happy that we learned world history in my school. We were really exposed to other cultures. And Elvis Presley at the age of 6, so we learned something. Yeah.
It's funny for those of us who consider ourselves global souls. You never know what your inheritance is. You go through this uneasy relationship with your roots. Sometimes you run as far away as you can from what you consider your roots because you're looking for something else, and then suddenly you come back to it somewhere and realize what your inheritance is culturally. And one of those things that I know happened for you much later in your career is the Natya Shastras. And this is a second century text on performance, but I was struck by what you have to say about that and how that sort of changed things for you. So,
Jeet, you know about the Natya Shastras? I'm sure you do.
Not
you
enough.
have to say you do.
I'm so hybrid, I don't.
see what I have to deal with. I mean, God.
Kids these days.
Yeah, really, can't take him anywhere. But seriously, I really believe in rehearsals before we start shooting, and I spend about a year, after a script is done, looking at it in different aspects, and then before we start shooting, maybe a month of intense rehearsals. And the way I had been rehearsing for the longest time was sort of the Western sort of Stanislavski method of the method acting, where characters are called upon to go back to some kind of, be Freud in fact, some psychological moment that they can relate to in their own lives to the character that they're playing. And, it's a very good method, and etc. But then I was, about 4 years ago, a friend of mine in India who's a wonderful theatre director called Neelam Man Singh Chaudhary, said, have you heard of the Natya Shastras? And I said, yes, I have. It's, like Sirish said, it's a second century text on drama. And it teaches you, and it's, like about more than 1,000 pages long, and it explores every aspect of dance, drama, music, and gives you tools on how each aspect all of the performing arts can be dealt with. So, whether it's music, and Ravi Shankar used it a lot when he composed his music, and many artists do as well. And what struck me about the Natya Shastras is that it's all about emotion. So according to the Natya Shastras, there are 9 human emotions. Whether it's it's humor, love, hatred, repulsion, wonderment, silence, bravery, humor, and peace is the main one. And some permutation and combination of all those emotions is what a character in a film or in a play has to access. So, for example, if as a hero or heroine of a film, and I have to say, I love you. And you would never ever say it from the emotional center of just pure love. Because according to the Natya Shastras, all emotions are a permutation and combination of every aspect of those 9 rasas. So what you do is you build up a really complex character. And what we did was make a grid on the floor with the 9 emotions. So every square represented an emotion. And an actor would walk along all those 9 emotions, and I'd say, stop. And if she would find herself in the box of hatred, she had to say, I love you, from the aspect of hatred. So what you really get to explore yourself as a human being. And my life got changed. And I must tell you, one of the things that really got me about the Natya Shastra is that there are great myths about how it originated, 5,000 years ago. And one of the myths that is the most popular and that I love is that Shiva, who's the god of destruction, and Brahma, the creator, in the Holy Trinity in Hinduism, and Vishnu, the preserver, was sort of hanging around because they'd created the world, and they were sort of saying, yeah, it's really a cool place, and everybody looks really happy, and there's no disease, there's no everybody's well fed, and sort of Shiva, who's always sort of known as the shit disturber, said, yeah, everything is fine, but it's kind of boring. So Brahma was very offended by this, and he said, what do you mean the world that I've created can't be boring? He said, just look at everybody. They're doing their thing, and they're happy, but they look unmotivated. So he said, yeah, maybe you're right. So what do you think is lacking? And Shiva thought about it, and he said, entertainment. And that's how the Natya Shastras were written. So I thought, what a great story it is. Yeah, that's why I love the Natya Shastras.
And I mean, speaking of entertainment and performance, Jeet is one such. And chatting before, Deepa wanted to ask you about your music, so you leave me out of it and go for it.
But isn't that for theater mainly that they use that?
Yeah, but the whole idea is that drama. When I feel that any actor that I'd like to work with, if they have a background in theater, I'm blessed.
Sure.
Because the discipline that comes from theater, about whether it's performance or whether it's even production design or it's the whole aspect of presentation, really helps in cinema.
And it makes it gives you a kind of background that always comes in handy.
Always.
In front of a camera.
And I think those 9 emotions, the 9 rasas as they're called, are so cover all aspects of what is possible.
And isn't it very different from the idea of method?
It's totally different.
Right.
So, it's like sort of what you said earlier, that you're embracing something that it never even struck me to access it. And I was so sort of caught in the Russian, the Stanislavski method of getting an actor to prepare, that I never looked at something that is so, in my own sort of background, and is so rich in its in what it has to offer. But anybody who's interested in theater, you can get a copy of the Natya Shastras from Amazon.com or whatever, and they're really good translations. And the one that's fabulous is one by Girish Karnad.
Oh, right, of course. Yeah. One of the great Indian
Playwrights
scholars and playwrights.
Yeah. So we have to hear about music and
Oh,
poetry
yeah.
and how did that happen?
Well, when you start writing poetry or even writing fiction, you are never told at that stage that you're going to have to read in public. This is a whole new thing. This is part of the idea of literature as part of a literary festival. And this isn't how it used to be 20 or 30 years ago, Writers 20 or 30 years ago, they wrote books. That's all they did. Which is why V.S. Naipaul has written 25 books, He says if he had to write a book and then spend a year or two promoting it, he wouldn't have written as many books as he's written. So, but what happens when you read in public is you have to develop a whole other set of skills, because it really is completely separate from your real job, which is to sit alone in a room and write. And sitting alone in a room and writing, it's really, there's nothing, there's no worse torture, honestly, because you're alone, first of all, in a room, and that's it. I mean, it's what happens to people if you commit a terrible crime, right? And
it's called solitary. Yes.
Solitary confinement. We do this to ourselves voluntarily, day after day. For what earthly reason? I mean, you have to be a deeply damaged individual to think there's some value in that kind of suffering, right? So anyway, so that's a very solitary kind of occupation. And then you come into a room like this and you read your work to human beings, and it's a whole other thing. It's a very gratifying, it's the opposite of the process of it. But it also requires a set of skills that you never signed up for. You have to learn theater skills,
totally. Yeah.
projection, voice projection. You have to learn
about brevity. Yeah,
brevity. You have to learn about
truly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay then. You have to learn about silence, breathing, timing.
Breathing, timing. To the ninth emotion, yes.
Yeah. Which is peace.
Yeah. No, so tell me,
And so, you develop those things on the road, on the fly, if you're lucky. But I also think of some great poets I've known who are terrible readers.
That's true. That really is. And that kills it somehow.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious. I really,
Well, I've always gone to readings by poets I've loved, not to hear the poems, but to hear the mistakes. And, to see the screw-ups. The socks that don't match, or the stains, the coffee stains on the tie.
Oh,
None of
lovely.
which you're guilty of, by the way.
No, but seriously, don't you think? That did you find that you had to develop it with time, or were you right into it, or?
No, it took time. My first reading, I remember, second big reading was at the Edinburgh Festival many years ago, in maybe the early 90s, and I was one of 5 poets in the poetry tent, which was a small tent, and just before the reading, I had to vomit. I was so nervous. So I went to find the bathroom tent, which is right across the festival, and I finally found it, puked. Came out, washed my face, looked in the mirror and thought, what an amateur, And then heard somebody else puking. And it was Ben Okri.
Oh my God!
Who had just won the Booker Prize. So I thought, it's okay.
Yeah. It's all right. Maybe it's even a good sign, really.
Maybe it makes you better.
Yeah, it really does,
Yeah, get rid of all the toxic stuff. But no, I mean, the reason we're talking about this is also because we're talking about, when we talked about the Natya Shastras, it's about what treasures you can mine from the past, and hybridity in terms of not just culture, but also genres. I mean, you're a poet, you're a musician, you're a novelist, and sometimes these cross-pollinations between even genres can be so rich. But that brings me to language, which both of you, I mean, again, leave me out of it. Language.
Well, visual language.
The great, okay. Well, they say in films is that if you can show it, you don't have to talk about it, and
right.
that's the great challenge. And in fact, I mean, I'd like to. The biggest challenge that I faced with that was in Midnight's Children, because it was, yes, I can show it, but I really miss Salman Rushdie's language. Because when I think about one of the reasons I was attracted to the book is because of the language. I mean, it's so beautiful. And the way going back to it, the way he sort of, for me personally, he reinvented English to make it my English. And that was in 1983, I mean, I was walking around Delhi and was stunned by what I'd read, which was Midnight's Children.
It was the first time we had read a book in which we recognized the English.
Yes, as our language.
As our language.
As the one that
as an Indian language.
As an Indian language. He made English into an Indian language. And so I really missed that, because, of course, when we shot the film, I mean, a lot of it, we were showing it. And it was, in fact, at the end of the film, for those of you who've seen it, and I know Jeet has, and that I thought, I said, Salman, something is really missing, and what we're missing is the language.
So you had the voiceover. I
had the voiceover. That was at the end. Those are
some of the beautiful lines in the book.
In the book, yeah.
What I found most moving about the movie Midnight's Children was the way you showed the emergency. Because in the book, I mean, it's a masterpiece, but in the book, the emergency doesn't jump out at you. By then you've been you've been amazed by so much, But in the movie, the way and I don't know how you did it. It was something about the color and just the look of it. It reminded all of us that the emergency really was a kind of a turning point in Indian history, and it's something that should never be forgotten.
And it's interesting, Jeet, and that how few people know about it.
Yeah, that's right.
It's quite. We really found out because when Midnight's Children was sort of being distributed all over the world, is that first of all people thought Indira Gandhi was Mahatma Gandhi's daughter, and secondly they'd never heard about the emergency. And as Indians growing up in India, and even you're right, it was a pivotal point.
Absolutely.
Where all our values got questioned, where democracy really was suspended. And we really realized how precious freedom of expression was. And so it was interesting. But then again, it was the colors, we said.
What did you do with the colors?
We took out all the color.
Right.
A time when there's no freedom.
Right.
Is colorless, so it felt like something so obvious, but we tried it, and I think it worked.
It absolutely worked in a very deep, in a core part of the head. Yeah.
But I felt that same way when I was reading Narcopolis, and we were speaking about it yesterday. It's just a stunning book. It's stunning on many levels, but the inherent core for it that speaks to me to this day, and I read it about 8 months ago, and then once recently, is there's a presence of somebody that's not there. So there are many, and like you said, there are many ghosts, and there's and so again, it's that language. How do you write? And you did, and you managed it. How do you write something that doesn't exist? And that language for me is fascinating, because that voice is a very different voice than Dom's or Dimpy's or even all the characters.
Well, it's not. We had this conversation yesterday over dinner, and later when I thought about it, I was thinking how much kind of ground we covered in kind of 10 minutes or something.
I know.
It's not something I've often talked about Narcopolis, but it is. The novel has everything to do with grief and with the loss of a spouse, and that's, I think, it is the engine that drives the book. It is loss and grief. Yeah.
No, for sure. And this we covered while eating Vikram's popsicles.
Lamb
popsicles, which were just to die for. No, but I also it's Narcopolis. I mean, there's a whole slew of Indian English literature that has come out in the last few years, but it stands out. It's unique, and I think that have you guys read it? You must. You have to just pick it up and buy it like tomorrow or today or something, and because it's poetry. It really is. And also, I think that what it did for me is that whether it's a film or whether it's a book or a drama or anything, that unless it opens what Huxley called the door of perception, it's worthless. And unless we learn something that's different, or we knew sort of existed but didn't know how it existed in this particular place and time, and I think I sort of question its validity, and what you did was open that door, which I did not know about this world. So if you're into exploration, that's internal exploration. It is just superb.
Thank you very much.
That's true.
I'm curious also, see, one of the things that hybrid souls, again, really struggle with is what's authentic. And we're often accused of being inauthentic. I mean, of course, fusion is a dangerous thing. Sure. We all know that. Some music, should be banned.
But we know that nothing should happen to Vikram and Sanjeev, right?
No, Vikram and Sanjeev, God bless them. But
you were talking about fusion and confusion yesterday.
Yeah. No, and it's a dangerous thing because you're making a new language. You're bound to stumble and stutter, but authenticity is something we search for. Authenticity is something that people kind of judge you by. What is authentic for us? And Deepa, you were saying earlier that when you did Fire, and Fire was in English, that this whole question of authenticity, would they have spoken in English, comes up. And Jeet, a lot of people ask you which language you write, and I face this as a writer, especially being in Canada, or any in the Anglo-Saxon world. They're like, oh, you write in English, and it's sort of trying to explain. I don't even know where to start, but maybe you folks can.
Well, again, I'm going to disappoint you terribly, but the only language I can read and write in is English.
But what's that?
I don't think that's
true. That's fabulous.
And I don't think I'm very special. Actually, there's lots of people like me in India, and it's the only language we can read and write in. And when you get this question, and this question especially comes up in Indian poetry, much more than fiction for some strange reason. Poets really have it the hardest. The question of authenticity, as if to say that you cannot write poetry in any language other than the one your grandmother spoke. But, the point is, my mother's tongue is not my mother tongue. My mother's tongue is Malayalam, my mother tongue is English. So for me to write in Malayalam is inauthentic. I would have to learn it, I would have to fake it. And it just strikes me as a kind of an obsolete argument.
And also it's irrelevant, I feel. I think that there's authenticity comes from character. And it comes from honesty, and it comes from portrayal. It comes from a cadence, which can be in English or Hindi or whatever. But like Jeet, the language that I first learned was English, and this was in Delhi. Punjabi I understand, Hindi I understand and speak really well. But if somebody said, "What are your favorite four of even five Hindi authors?" I could name three, but not more than that. So it just opens up your world. It opens up the options one has, and like I said, Salman really did us a favor.
He really did.
He really did us a huge favor.
But the thing is, he did us that favor in 1982.
I know.
It's been a while.
I know, and we're still talking about it. It's all your fault, Sirish.
First
You brought it up.
Then
Just kidding.
No, but it's a fact. It's
still.
Like you were saying, this is a criticism, strangely enough, that comes up only in India.
In India, it doesn't come up here, or it doesn't come up in England or anywhere else. But when Fire was made, I mean, we were just talking about it earlier, that it was in Delhi that I got the most flack. Right. That, how can you make it in English? These people would not be speaking in English. And so it was interesting.
And there was other flack for controversy, with Fire and with Water.
I know.
And I know this is boring too, but could we just address this briefly?
Okay.
What I want to ask is, you faced flack for Fire and for Water for just absolutely irrelevant reasons, and of course in India. And you said that you loved satanic verses, and the question I would ask is, did you ever think of making satanic verses? And if not, would it have something to do with a kind of future knowledge that making a movie version of satanic verses would bring up a whole raft of accusations and criticisms that you'd just rather not deal with?
I did think of making satanic verses, just because I think it would make a stunning.
It would
make a stunning film, a very long film, but a stunning film. And I don't think that I spoke to Salman about it, except he does know how much I really like it. And the reason I didn't make it was that I felt, and this is what I mean about what controversy does to one.
Right.
I was being interviewed this morning, and somebody said, "And how do you feel about being controversial or something?" And I said, that's one word that I really despise. Yeah. I feel it limits my work. I feel I'm judged through the glasses of controversy. We're talking about even language, and it's very demeaning. I feel really insulted, because in a way, exactly what you just said, it limits sometimes what I really want to do, because I know that if I had done satanic verses, the combination of Salman and myself, it sort of became lethal anyways. But satanic verses and Deepa Mehta would have just done it, So I don't know. I really, maybe I'm getting too old to deal with this, and somebody younger can do it. I don't have the energy.
But I just feel that it's a kind of a tragedy in a way.
Of course, it's very tragic. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Because that kind of sort of self-limitation of self. That's what controversy does. Is on some level there is a bit of self-censorship,
right?
Which is truly, I think. It's a tragic. It's tragedy.
And it's for non-artistic reasons.
Totally for non-artistic reasons. But if you've been around and you've seen your effigy being burnt, and you've seen your sets being bombed, and you see the press, having a field day about why you've sold your soul to the West. It's like, what are you talking about? And
I was in India when the whole water thing hit the fan. And I don't think people in Canada know quite how vicious it was.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think they do. Yeah. And you don't want to. So we never got to the music.
Oh, well, I started to write poems and play music and draw and read. In fact, all around the same time. At the age of 14. It was in the mid-'70s in Hong Kong. I was living in Hong Kong. My father is an editor and a writer, and he started a magazine in Hong Kong called Asia Week. And so I went to school in Hong Kong and discovered drugs in the mid-'70s, as you do, And it was all kind of tied in. And, the thing about the drugs in the 70s, they were intelligent drugs. They weren't the stupid drugs of the 90s and the 2000s, mindless kind of house drugs. And they were mind expanding. They did kind of open your your horizons and the way you thought of the world and the universe and God and all those things. I don't mean to be an advocate for LSD, but so it was tied in. It was a very fruitful, very, very kind of exciting, unpredictable time. Everything, politics, fashion, music, art, seemed to be exploding at the same time. And I think it was extremely formative for many of us at the time. And of course, I had no idea how formative until much later. And for many years, I wanted to be a musician, kind of full-time musician, and never made it. You know, I think and this is something I've discovered too about musicians and writers. Musicians are really treated very badly. You sleep on couches, you travel on buses, you're hardly paid. Writers, you know, we live fairly well. It's, yeah. Yeah, I'm glad I have an option.
You're glad you have a day job? So that's the music. What were you studying in school? What did you...
Oh, the obvious. Literature. I went back to India for a BA at Wilson College, part of Bombay University. And for the second year of that BA in literature, I was the only student in the English department. I had 3 professors. 1 student.
Are you serious?
Nobody else was foolish enough to do English literature. They were all doing economics and sociology and useful things. So. Well, it made it difficult to cut classes. They noticed. And then many years later, I did an MFA in poetry in the U.S. in Sarah Lawrence College. And it was an expensive degree, 2 years, poetry, MFA, and after that, with this kind of overqualification, I went into journalism, of all things. Newspaper called India Abroad in New York.
Sure,
yeah. Well, if you don't know this newspaper, it's a newspaper that has survived very well, in fact, on matrimonial ads.
And horoscopes.
Horoscopes. And immigration lawyers ads.
Yes.
And in between the matrimonial ads and the immigration lawyers ads, there's some, white space which has to be filled up by employees like me. That was my job.
And then did you, so were you writing poetry while you were writing for India Abroad?
I was. Yeah. I had a slim book of poems in 5 years, which was about all I could manage with a full-time journalism job and a full-time job in drugs, That's also a full-time job. And, and it wasn't until I quit drugs and quit working, which happened at the same time. Once I quit drugs, I realized I didn't need to work. I didn't need a salary, money wasn't so urgent, so I could quit the job and become a full-time writer. So, I moved in 2004. I quit journalism, and I moved from the U.S. to India and became a full-time writer. Best thing that happened.
So one of the things that I find that just reading Narcopolis and reading about you is that what always comes up is the drug habit and giving it up. And do you find it easy talking about it, or do you find it like really boring now? How does it work?
No, I don't mind talking about it. I'm still happy and grateful to be clean, and I never take it for granted. And I know how difficult it was. It's been 10 years now, but I still remember how difficult it was the last time that I quit, to actually quit. It took 1.5 years on a methadone program, and I could never take it for granted. So I still wake up thinking I'm back in those days. So I'm grateful and happy to have survived it, as so many people I know didn't.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it isn't a drag talking about it?
No,
or?
not yet.
Not yet, okay. You let me know. Okay. No, because it's the honesty of your approach is very very moving to me. It's especially in Narcopolis, and how you deal with it and talk about it.
Well, last night,
Because
Lindsay's
it isn't about
mother,
it's not about from a moral, pedestal at all. It's just about matter of fact, and it's an addiction, and addictions are difficult to get rid of.
And I think the one thing that addiction teaches you is to never judge anyone.
That's true.
It's something William Burroughs said in one of his novels. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, true.
Of course you would.
Yeah.
If it was you, you'd do all of that stuff, So how could I possibly judge anyone, And so to have a character in a novel who is a eunuch, has been a prostitute, is an addict, and then starts to educate herself by reading books, is considered all those characters considered lowest of the low,
Oh yeah. And some of them are really scary. Yeah.
Certainly, one of them is scary.
One of them is very scary. Yeah.
So it made sense somehow.
Interesting.
What were you saying about Lindsay's mother? She's a fine woman.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. She is a fine woman. She said last night. I heard that interview on CBC, the Eleanor Wachtel interview, and she said, I was just surprised at the kind of things you said, and I wondered if someone interviewed me, would I be able to keep their attention for whatever length of time? And I said, well, if you were to be completely frank, and when you were asked a question and not keep anything hidden, I think you would be. I think anybody would.
Anybody can. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
There is something about honesty that's completely liberating, because you don't have to keep track of what you shouldn't have said or what's not true. So that works.
You don't have to keep track of the falsehoods
I know,
and the half-truths.
And the half-truths, because that's very time-consuming.
It is.
Well, since we're in Vancouver, there's a particular history here. Let's go back. I think that some of the cross-pollination that we've experienced, say some of the issues with language, with English, we have to, admit colonization and empire was a huge chunk of that. And here in Vancouver, not that long ago, there was the Kamagata Maru incident. And here we are in what seems to be, and it is a much more easily hybrid, mixed society. But you were going to make a film on the Kamagata Maru.
I still am. It's just,
okay.
I'll definitely do it. I just think that, I was feeling the intense pressure of doing it before the anniversary next year. And I started to feel uncomfortable about it, because I think it's such a huge topic. And it's, I was telling the story to Jeet yesterday, and he said, my God, it's a natural. And it is. It's about race, it's about, about politics, it's about... my name for the film is actually Exclusion, because that's what it was. It was about exclusion. And I've written the script, and I wanted to take my time with the casting and to do it right, and to be able to not rely on digital, manufacture of the boat and people, and like to do it authentically. And that takes a bit of time. And so I said, let me take a couple of years, do something else, while the producers looking for the right time, and then to do it properly.
I'm glad you're working on it.
I love it. It's.
And you have a script written.
I have a written script. Yeah. I haven't cast it as yet.
Well, only a matter of time.
Only a matter of time.
And some of the details in the story you were saying, it just struck me that you couldn't make that stuff up.
No, it's it's the whole thing about fiction,
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, it's stunning, and it's a very moving story. I think that's what really gets me. It's moving, it's inspiring, it's depressing, but it's like everything that's historical. It opens again another window of perception. Yeah.
And although it's of a very specific time period, it's timeless in a way. It's
Absolutely.
as relevant today as it ever was.
And there was something that, I don't know if Buñuel, who's one of my favorite directors, Spanish directors of all time, said that the minute you're specific is the very minute you become universal and timeless.
Right.
And I think that this is such a specific story, and I think if you stick to that specific whatever, then you.
How many C's?
Yeah, I know.
The specific city.
That's it. That's why he's the writer, right? Is that you can capture that, that scope, that universal and timeless scope of it.
Yeah. I'm thinking aloud here, just because you put me here. But thinking about the diaspora. And diaspora, of course, comes from spore. It's a very botanical reference. And I was thinking, for a lot of us, the way we've moved around the world is very botanical. The bloody Brits picked us up from somewhere,
scattered us,
uprooted us, seeds, scattered us, planted us somewhere, often to work on plantations. So, there's a very botanical thing going on around here. But Jeet, I was wondering, it's bothered me, and I've always wondered, and like you said about Salman Rushdie, in 82 he invented a new language, it's been a while, and I'm thinking empire, it's been a while. Apart from Joseph Conrad, has anyone really engaged with empire in fiction and poetry? I can't think of anything.
Well, Naipaul has done it in a kind of a reverse way in some ways. He's he's done it sort of from their side, in a way, and but of course inhabited completely from a kind of doubly displaced Indian, and I think that's the narrative that you find in every single book by Naipaul, and it's something that's his wound, And
it's the enigma of arrival.
Yeah.
That says it all.
It all, exactly. In fact, that's his true autobiography.
True as I think so.
Yeah.
I really do. I think that is his autobiography. And
it's supposed to be a novel.
But it's not.
It's not.
Yeah. And it is an open wound.
It is.
And
it's a wound that will never heal.
Yeah.
And it's a wound that you think about this 18-year-old vegetarian Brahmin
from Trinidad,
taking a ship to London, sitting in his hotel room and having to eat above a waste paper basket because he doesn't want to get any of the crumbs on the floor, and then going to school and writing a book, and no publisher picks it up, and genuinely thinking about suicide for 2 years, And then, of course, this 18-year-old from Trinidad is transformed into a perfect Englishman.
Brown Sahib, he was the ultimate Brown Sahib, wasn't he? Yeah.
From his accent to his cottage in Wiltshire,
Yeah.
It's a kind of a parable in ways, it tells us that the idea of colonialization and empire is never going to go away, and it's not even something that's going to disappear in the next generation. It stays in names, in place names, and people's names. It stays in the kind of fervor with which we fight those names.
Totally.
Changing Bombay to Mumbai, and the kind of constant war that entails.
I know, Chennai and
Trivandrum to Thiruvananthapuram.
Impossible.
Bangalore to
Bengaluru or something like that. Whatever.
Why would you want Bengal in a name for a city in Karnataka?
It's like us and our, the Queen on our currency. That's also a colonial hang-up. Sooner than later, I'd like Trudeau to be there personally.
Right?
I was thinking of our currency has the Queen's. The Canadian currency has the Queen's picture on it. So this still does. And we really have very strong monarchists in this country. Luckily we're just sort of going away from it, but that for many Canadians is heritage of Canada. The poor, First Nation just forgotten completely. It's a real tragedy. Yeah.
Well, the idea of the UK and the Commonwealth, we still use those words.
Commonwealth, yes.
That would be
Commonwealth.
nice, Commonwealth.
Yeah. Bring it on.
Bring it on. We can take it.
You know where
Give
to
us our
find me,
share.
baby.
It's true.
So, I mean, you have a few questions left for each other, or shall we ask Jeet to read poetry?
Oh, he was amazing last night. We have to share that. Come on, Jeet.
No, in fact, Jeet, I mean, last night, in the middle of a dinner, Jeet stood up and delivered this set of beautiful poems. What are they? The How to Become? How to be.
How to be,
The How
yeah.
to Be poems. And I thought of that. That's one kind of hybridity. And please, I know you'll kill me for this, but please repeat verbatim. Because that was so beautiful, you must do it exactly as you did last
Well,
night.
how many? I apologize in advance if there were many of you who were there last night. And,
Nothing to apologize for.
check. Well, the good thing about these poems is that they are very short. You don't have to steel yourself for an epic. They're entries, they're not even poems, they're entries in a kind of a how-to guide, a self-help manual. And they tell you how to be various creatures. The first one tells you how to be a toad. This one is useful for actors and actresses, if there are any in the audience. Actors think about beauty a lot. How to be a toad. Take 3 spores with a dram of rum. Hold it on your tongue for longish moments. Pack all thoughts of gold in a small leather case the size of a sapphire. Tell yourself repeatedly, I will never again be beautiful. How to be a leaf. Hold your breath until you are God's green thoughts. Stop eating. The air will suffice for food. Water is another matter. The skin absorbs nutrients. The eyes adjust. The limbs grow inward. Conjugate patience. Worship women and trees. That's a feminist one. How to be a horse. Know the nostril. All power gathers there. Inflate yours until the blood rings. It will take all your training to be horse, not ass. This is a thin crossing, perilous to the absent-minded and the estranged of heart. Avoid all latitudes. Latitudes, because the horse latitudes is where, the Spanish galleons, when they were stuck without a breeze, the first things that went overboard were the stallions, the horses. How to be a crow. Oh, by the way, last night I forgot some crucial lines from this poem, which is what happens when you're saying things from memory, so I'll make up for that today. How to be a crow. Learn to name the animals one by one. Stinking, babbling, breedy, querulous, maddened, jet. Usurp the duties of God. Why not? After all, this is what poets do. As for crow, kill color, turn black, not nigger black.
Beautiful. Really.
And finally, how to be a bandicoot, which is a large Bombay rat, kind of a Shiv Sena rat. A rat that's impossible to kill. You can't drown these rats because they know how to swim. You cannot poison them. They like poison. They have it for breakfast. They have it on their toast for breakfast. You can't drop them from a tall building because they bounce and scamper away. You could try to shoot them with a large bore rifle, but even that is no guarantee that they won't come back. How to be a bandicoot. Assume dominance over the underworld. Your enemies are legion. Eat them. Eat everything. You must build your strength. A crash will surely come. Your eyes are red legends. Your name is Adam.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Wow. Amazing.
So I think we should turn the mics over for questions, and I know that Margaret in the front row has a burning question. So I'm going to give the first question to you.
I got to ask all those questions of Jeet yesterday. So I guess I'm looking around the room and seeing that we are increasingly in places where people are from come from different places, are having babies with people from different places. So what does that mean for cultural hybridity? What does that mean in terms of retaining one's culture and becoming something new? And how much do you hold on to the threads?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, no. People say that that's going to be the last bastion when there's cross marriages and those lines get blurred. And perhaps it would be a good thing, because then we'll just hold on to whatever part of the culture that we want to, and that works for us, and that isn't thrust upon us. I personally like the idea of choice more than anything else in the world, because that means a certain kind of freedom. Maybe it'll be a more peaceful world.
And again, I think it also is a way of making us less judgmental, and less narrow. It just widens your opinions and your view of yourself in the world in a way that can only help, and help others, and help your interaction with others. And I can't help but see it as a kind of a very positive,
no, for sure, it is
a
something
hopeful sign for the future.
And can you imagine? I mean, then there'll be no judgment about color. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah.
And then preconceptions, because that's what kills us too. You're Indian, so you must love curry. Whatever. It's. I think for me, that's what's really sometimes irritating. One of my great stories was when I first flew into Canada. I was taken. My husband and myself, who is from Canada, and is white. He's my ex-husband now, so that's good. But we were taken to a ball game. I'd never been to a ball game in my life, and of course had dressed inappropriately for it and worn a sari. So that was a bit absurd. But we got there, and there was, the gentleman was a really extremely learned and intelligent man. In fact, was John Bassett, who was the senior, who was the owner of CTV and stuff. And we had a rather heated and passionate conversation about something. And then he said, he stopped in the middle and he said, "You speak really good English." And he said, and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "And where did you learn?" And I said, "On the plane coming over." So he said, he was very impressed. So we're talking about language and stuff,
It's a long flight.
That's exactly 17 hours.
He had no idea who he was dealing with, basically.
It was funny.
I always also think of something the great Indian poet A.K. Ramanujan said. He was teaching at the University of Chicago for many years, I think for decades. He was one of the early recipients of the MacArthur Award, the Genius Award, and he translated these folk tales from all over India into English, into beautiful English. And he wrote beautiful poems in English, as well as translations from Kannada and Tamil of very early poetry. So when somebody asked him, they were just inventing the phrases Indian American and Indian Canadian and American Indian, all these phrases were just being invented. They asked him what he thought of Indian American, and he said in that phrase, Indian American, he located himself in the hyphen.
That's. Can I say that I said it? It's really how wonderful.
Yeah.
It's because it gets too tiring to be, are you this, are you that, and what does it mean if you're an Indian? It's obvious I'm Indian, I'm
and
Indian, I'm very
proud.
And why should I choose? And it's obvious to me that I'm Canadian because, Jeet, I've said this very often, people said, are you Canadian, are you Indian, are your films Indian, are they Canadian? And I say, if India inspires me with its stories, Canada gives me the freedom to express those stories. So for me, both are equally important, and I cannot do one without the other. And why should I be one or the other when I love them both? It sounds, well, I love them sometimes, but, but I do.
It's a gentleman there in the blue T-shirt.
Beautiful.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to kind of continue that vein because I feel for myself, hybridity is not a steady state. It is like water sloshing in a bowl. You kind of go back and forth between various poles. And for me, I have an Indian stepfather, an Indonesian father, a mother that has Aboriginal heritage, and so it's a very confusing world. And I see how easy for you today it is to talk about hybridity, and yet for both of you, your work is very much about some of the things that rub you raw around it. And I kind of wanted to know a little bit more. Can you tell me how the notion of hybridity does rub you raw at times?
Jeet?
I think, in fact, Deepa just addressed that.
I just said it.
And, the whole idea of
preconceptions.
And the idea of wanting to tell stories set in about one place and not being able to even shoot those stories in India.
I couldn't do them.
Yeah.
The stories that I have told in my films, I couldn't shoot water in India, for
you
example.
had to do it in Sri Lanka.
I had to do it in Sri Lanka. So, so you have that, you get inspired by a few stories, but to express them sometimes you have to actually be quite inventive. And that's good. It really is good. I think that water was stopped in the year 2000 when we were shooting it in Varanasi in India by Hindu fundamentalists who said it was anti-Hindu for some reason. And, the sets were bombed. It was really awful. And I didn't shoot the film for 7 years after that. It took me 7 years to get over that absolute feeling of anger. And, anger is a very strong emotion, but it's not a very clean lens. And I knew that if I ever had to do a film that I really cared about, a script that I really cared about, I couldn't do it till I was angry. And it took me about 7 years to get over that anger. So, but I think that shooting it in Sri Lanka really helped it because I didn't have the weight of what was expected from me. So you learn to be inventive. And that's the good thing about it. So use it. Don't be confused by it. Just embrace it, I think. And I think that's what I've done. I am who I am, and it doesn't and I don't get into definitions. They really irritate me and confuse me. So I just am myself. It's true.
And absolutely, that's hybridity rubbing raw.
That's, exactly. That's the wrong,
Okay. I was interested in what Jeet was saying about Ramanujan and about Indian poetry in English. And I'm wondering, the only Indian poets writing in English that are familiar to most people are people like Don Moraes or Vikram Seth or Sujata Bhatt or Imtiaz Daka, who have lived abroad and been published abroad. Is it something to do with the Indian publishing scene, or is it the scene in the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world that deprives us, even for instance of your book, 60 Indian Poets, which would be very useful for people to have? Why is it that we can't access so many books of the vast number of really good poets writing in English from India?
The name that I would like to give you is Lawrence Battleman. He's a poet, great Indian poet that nobody knows about, who died in Vancouver. In fact, there's a housing estate named after him, the Lawrence Battleman Estate. And he was working in public housing for a while and died early of alcoholism, as poets do. When he was very young, he published, I think, 5 books in India with Writer's Workshop, and astonishing poems for a 20-year-old poet. But nothing came out of them. He made no money. He got no teaching offers. It was absolutely desolate, So he left it all and came to Canada and never wrote. I think, he had also written plays, but he didn't see a future in it. A great poet. Came to Canada, worked in public housing, drank himself to death. And what somebody should do is publish a collection of Lawrence Battleman.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Canada Council can, I'm sure, help with that. That's amazing.
And in fact, he's one of 5 names I could think of.
Oh, wow.
That have been forgotten and really shouldn't have been. And they are in that anthology. There's a larger version of that anthology called the Blood Axe Book of Contemporary Indian Poets, which is 72 poets. But again, you can't really find that easily. Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. There was one with the mic already back there, and one right in the front row here. In the front row, yeah.
Hi, Deepa and Jeet. Thank you for sharing your stories and experiences tonight. I'm here. Hi. Really relates to what you just shared, Jeet, and also relates to your experiences with shooting Water, Deepa, around the trauma, transnational trauma, and really relates to Natya Shastras as well, the importance of emotions, colonization, empire. My question would be, what does art, different forms of art, poems, dance, music, movies, how does this trouble theories, critical concepts like colonization, different constructs of power? For example, I'm pretty sure many of us here know Shani Mutu's work and how critical she is in addressing transcolonial traumas. What do you think? How can artists, different forms of art, can engage with this kind of theories and really trouble the waters, especially because you're looking to
I think the question is understood.
Your next movie. So we'd love to know more about that.
Just before Deepa gets into this, I just want to say that if you're an artist and you think of phrases like transcultural
I know,
trauma,
I don't even know what it means.
And theorizing and all of that, you're not going to make anything. You'll just be so overwhelmed by the concepts of it that you won't, So, I think some things it's better for teachers and
academics
to talk about and not.
No, totally. I mean, and I think, it's not that it's what you're saying is valid, but I'm saying it's a different language and it's a different discipline, and if I'm sure, I think that some of our work is political, and I think art in some form or the other is always political, and it should be political. But I don't think it's self-consciously so. I don't feel that I have to address cultural trauma, because but what I can do is talk about something that moves me on a personal basis. And then what art does or film does, I think, to some extent is to make what you're talking about accessible on a simpler level. And then if you want to look at, say, what happens with exclusion or what happens with fire or water, you can always go to the library or Google it and get into it, later. But it's the first step. I don't look at it as my work as an academic work. It's purely artistic. I don't know, how would you feel?
And that's how it should be.
And that's how it should be, yeah.
The last question, please.
Speaking of writers addressing colonialism, Chinua Achebe comes to mind. Also speaking as someone who is not hybridized in any way, but is married to someone who is, one of the things that's really striking to me is how colonialism and hybridization are two sides of a coin. It's interesting that we're talking about it tonight, and how important amnesia is to the dominant culture. And what's striking to me with my husband's family, in particular his father, who is 90 years old and has been in Canada for almost 85 of those years, and how he bristles at Indo-Canadian, at the hybridization. He really bristles. But what's really apparent to me, coming from a completely different cultural background, is the hybridization is not only transnational, it's also through time. That the people on my husband's side of the family are so much more connected to the past, so much, and the family roots we are amputees and amnesiacs, the white Canadians, I think, in some ways. We don't relate to families in Europe the way that my husband's family, for instance, still relates to the families in India. So it's that passage through time. And what's striking to me is how much more connected the hybrid, so-called, is relative to a fairly dominant and fairly provincial dominant culture. Comment?
Sure. I think the fact of being displaced from a culture into another, it just makes something more visibly obvious that's actually happening to everybody. You don't have to have moved to another country or another city to feel displaced. You could have lived in one city, on one street in one city your whole life and feel completely displaced because everything around you has changed so much. For instance, Kiefer Street in Vancouver. I'm sure in the last 20 or 30 years, it's been unrecognizable the kind of changes that have occurred around it and will continue to occur. So hybridization, displacement, it's just really a modern... It's a condition. It's a human condition. It's the human condition.
And it's always been there. It's always been there. And I don't think that it belongs to people who have just migrated. And I think that would be looking at it very narrowly. I think actually Canadians really know about it. In a different way, perhaps, with a different lens. But people, we all know what it means being displaced, leaving your family home to live even across the street. When you leave your family home, when you go to university, you're being displaced. We all know what it's like, because being displaced, in my mind, and one of the reasons I love doing Midnight's Children was that for me the book is all about seeking home, identity, new families. And we all know about it. We don't have to be colored to know what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends whether you're the conqueror, the prospector, or the laborer when you move. And I think that makes such a huge
Yeah, of course it
difference
does.
to things.
Yeah.
So, really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sirish. You did very well.